Chapter 1. The throne hall smells like cedar, cold stone, and the particular brand of desperation that powerful men wear when they have run out of options. I know that smell. I invented a filing system for it once. Color-coded. Very efficient. I am standing just behind the eastern pillar when Ethan Blackwell walks through the main doors of Blackridge Palace, and I feel exactly nothing. That is the lie I tell myself for approximately 4 seconds before my chest does something complicated and embarrassing that I refuse to acknowledge in front of 3 alpha kings. Ethan looks terrible. Good. His traveling clothes are wrinkled. His authority, which once filled every room he entered like smoke filling a jar, has thinned into something uncertain and apologetic. He stops at the center of the throne hall with his pack's emergency petition clutched in both hands, and he lifts his eyes toward the 3 men seated above him. He does not see me yet. I step back further behind the pillar and take one slow breath. Hudson is already watching me from his seat. His expression asks a question without moving a single muscle in his face. I give him the smallest shake of my head. Not yet. He returns his eyes forward with the practiced patience of a man who has learned exactly when Parker Reed needs a moment and exactly when Parker Reed needs an exit. Ethan begins speaking. His voice carries the way alpha voices always do, designed by biology to command rooms, but today it only fills the space between the pillars like something lost looking for its echo. He explains Redwood's crisis with the careful precision of a man who rehearsed this speech for 6 days straight. Grain reserves depleted. Medicine shipments failing. 3 border villages without winter supply access. He needs emergency assistance. He needs Blackridge's cooperation. He needs it now. Wyatt's face throughout this entire speech is a wall. Not hostile, just immovable. Grant is reading a document. He has been reading that same document since Ethan walked in. I know because Grant reads everything twice and he has not turned the page. Hudson looks bored in the specific way that means he is paying attention to every single word. Ethan finishes. The hall goes quiet enough that I can hear the torch flames move. Then Hudson picks up a contract from the table beside his throne and holds it toward the empty air to his left, and says, conversationally, as though he is discussing whether our mate already rejected those terms. Ethan's head turns. I step out from behind the pillar. The look on his face is something I will carry for a long time and never quite be able to describe to anyone who was not standing in this room. It moves through recognition, disbelief, and something that cracks open at the center, all within the span of one breath. Parker, he says. I do not answer. Wyatt has already turned toward me in the way he does, not threatening, just present, the way a very large and deeply loyal person positions himself when someone from my past enters a room. Grant slides my chair 3 inches closer to his own without looking up from his document. I sit down. Ethan stares at me like I have appeared from somewhere impossible. 2 years ago, I was standing in a different hall. A smaller one. Redwood Pack's moon assembly room smelled like pine resin and ceremonial candles, and I had spent 40 minutes in the corridor outside it composing a speech in my head that I was absolutely going to pretend I had not written. I had even picked out what to wear. I had actual feelings about what to wear. It was embarrassing then and remains embarrassing now. Ethan was standing at the front of the room when I came in. He looked composed and handsome in mine, which was the only thing I was thinking when I noticed Noah Bennett standing beside him. I thought I had walked into the wrong assembly. I genuinely considered whether I had misread the door. Noah was young, polished, wearing the formal amber of the Bennett bloodline. He was standing 1 step closer to Ethan than a guest should stand, and every council member in the room already knew something I did not. Ethan explained it to me privately afterward. His voice was gentle. His hands were gentle. He used all the right words in all the wrong order, and what it amounted to was this. The council needed the Bennett alliance, and Noah would become Redwood's official consort, and nothing between Ethan and me needed to change because I could remain beside him privately, and was he not still choosing me in the ways that actually mattered? There was a long silence while I processed whether I was hearing what I was hearing. Should I move out of our room before or after everyone finishes congratulating you? I asked. He told me not to be dramatic. That was the moment I understood. Not the announcement. Not Noah's presence. Those words. Not dramatic. as though 5 years of quietly running every supply route, every emergency reserve, every winter delivery schedule in Redwood Pack was merely a performance I was giving. As though I was reacting badly instead of correctly, I removed the silver mate clasp from my collar. It was small, heavier than it looked. I placed it in his palm with the same care I had given everything in that pack, and I left. No screaming, no begging. I did not give him the satisfaction of watching me fall apart in front of his council. I walked out of Redwood with my real travel bag and I did not look back once, which was impressive because I desperately wanted to. Now Ethan is standing in front of 3 Alpha Kings with his petition and his exhausted eyes, and Wyatt turns to me with his usual economy of expression and says simply, "Mate." Ethan goes very still. Outside the throne hall, somewhere far below the mountain road, a supply carriage is moving toward Blackridge's northern border with 300 pounds of emergency grain I authorized this morning. Ethan looks at me. I look back at him. "Hello, Ethan," I say, and my voice is steady. His expression does something I have no category for. Behind me, I can still feel exactly how cold the mountain road was the night I left. The moment a royal carriage stopped and a stranger's voice came through the dark and said something that changed everything. Chapter 2. The carriage that stopped on the mountain road 2 years ago was the size of a small room and smelled like pine oil, leather, and 3 very different alpha scents layered so precisely over each other that for a moment I thought I was hallucinating from cold and exhaustion. The door opened. 3 men looked out at me. Not similar the way brothers sometimes are, similar the way mirrors are. Same jaw, same dark eyes, same particular stillness that very powerful people develop when they have stopped needing to prove anything. The only differences were in their expressions. The one on the left looked like he suspected me of a crime. The one in the middle looked like I had just become his favorite form of entertainment. The one on the right was simply watching me, calm and total, like weather. "Either you're incredibly brave or catastrophically stupid," the middle one said. I was standing on a mountain road in the dark, carrying everything I owned in one bag, running from the most humiliating night of my life, and the temperature had dropped far enough that my breath was coming out in visible clouds. "Can I be both?" I said. The one who suspected me of a crime narrowed his eyes. The entertained one laughed. The one watching me did not change expression, but something in his focus shifted, like a door opening precisely 1 inch. They let me into the carriage. This was, objectively, a terrible idea. Royal Alphas were sitting approximately at the bottom of my preferred company list at that specific moment in my life, somewhere just below tax collectors, food poisoning, and wet socks. I got in anyway because the alternative was freezing to death on a mountain, and I had just decided my life was worth more than a man who called me dramatic. Their names, which I learned over the following hour of deeply uncomfortable small talk, were Wyatt, Hudson, and Grant Ashford. The triplet Alpha Kings of Blackridge Crownlands. Wyatt controlled defense. Hudson managed diplomacy. Grant oversaw law. They had just concluded a trade summit 3 territories over, and were returning home when their carriage stopped because their lead driver spotted someone walking the mountain road alone after dark. That someone was me. Wyatt spent the first 20 minutes deciding whether I was a Redwood spy. I spent the first 20 minutes deciding whether to be offended by this. "You came from Redwood's direction," he said. His voice was flat and direct in a way that reminded me of a wall you cannot argue with, only around. "I came from my own direction," I said. "I happened to have been in Redwood's direction at the time." Hudson made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had been given permission to become one. Wyatt did not look amused. I was cold, exhausted, and running on exactly one decision that still felt right, which was that I had left. Everything after that was uncertain. I had no safe destination, no confirmed allies, and enough heartbreak sitting in my chest to power a small city. What I did have was the thing I always had, which was that I noticed things. I had noticed the suspension bridge 6 miles back. I had crossed it twice in the last month, delivering supply documents between Redwood and its eastern trade partners, which meant I knew the standard load weights used on that route. What I had seen from the road this evening was the way the center support cables were angled wrong. Not broken, wrong. Like someone had adjusted the tension incorrectly, or like someone had adjusted the tension correctly for a purpose that had nothing to do with bridge safety. The Kings were planning to send their winter grain convoy through that route tomorrow. I weighed the options for approximately 8 seconds and then said, "Your supply convoy is going to destroy that bridge." Every person in the carriage went completely silent. Wyatt's expression moved from suspicious to actively hostile. "Excuse me." I explained the weight distribution problem. I used the actual numbers because vague warnings from strangers on mountain roads were easy to dismiss, and I needed this one taken seriously. The center cables were bearing load at the wrong angle for the volume of grain those carriages carried. The bridge would hold light traffic. It would not hold 300 tons of winter food. Wyatt thought I was bluffing. I kept explaining. Grant stopped me at the fourth calculation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something to Wyatt in a low voice that I could not fully hear. Wyatt's jaw tightened. He leaned out of the carriage window and issued a command to the escort riders. The convoy turned around. 12 hours later, scouts reported structural damage to the bridge's central support beam. Someone had made precise cuts to 3 of the load-bearing cables. Hidden. Professional. The kind of damage that looks like wear until 400 tons of grain is sitting above it. The convoy would have collapsed into the ravine. The Kings sat with this information for a long moment. Hudson looked at me with an expression I had not seen on an alpha's face before. Something that was not attraction or suspicion, but something closer to recalibration. "How did you know?" he asked. "I delivered supply schedules across that bridge twice a month," I said. "I paid attention." Grant said nothing. He was looking at me the way someone looks at a document they need to read twice before they decide what it means. We offered each other a trade. 30 days of sanctuary in Blackridge in exchange for my help identifying the bridge saboteur. I agreed. Nobody rescued me. I bought my own safety with the one currency nobody had bothered stealing when they took everything else. 3 days later, examining the burn supplier marking on the damaged beam, I recognized the company crest. It belonged to a trade consortium operating out of Redwood territory. Chapter 3. Blackridge's supply system was not failing. It was being taken apart piece by piece with the patience of someone who had been doing it for years and had no particular reason to hurry because nobody had noticed yet. I noticed on day 4. I had been given a small working room near the administrative wing, which was already an improvement over being a stranger on a mountain road. The Kings had assigned me a stack of flagged shipment reports that their own logistics staff had been unable to reconcile. 3 missing medicine deliveries. 2 grain invoices paid twice. 1 emergency warehouse that contained 30% less inventory than the official count. Individual problems their staff had concluded. Clerical errors. I lined them up on the floor of my working room because the desk was too small, which was my first official complaint about Blackridge, and looked at them the way I had learned to look at Redwood's supply network. Not at what was missing, at the shape of what was missing. The shape was not random. The delays always hit the same 3 villages. The duplicate invoices always came from the same 4 supplier contacts. The warehouse shortfalls were always in the same category of goods: medicine, emergency grain, and cold weather materials. Things people needed most in winter. Things whose absence would be felt the hardest and noticed the latest. I walked into the council chamber on the morning of day 5 and told the 3 Alpha Kings of Blackridge that someone was dismantling their kingdom's supply network from the inside. There was a silence. Wyatt said, "You were hired to find one saboteur." "Congratulations," I said. "You have considerably more than one." I showed them the tracking map I had built overnight. Shipping delays cross-referenced with invoice duplication cross-referenced with warehouse discrepancies cross-referenced with bridge damage. Every line led back to the same cluster of supplier contacts. Every supplier contact, when traced through their business registration records, connected back to a parent company. I did not yet know who owned that parent company, but I knew the shape of what they were doing, and the shape was coordinated, patient, and designed to cause the maximum amount of damage at the point in the year when fixing it would be most difficult. Grant leaned over the map for a long time without speaking. His reading posture was distinctive, completely still, like he was having a private conversation with the paper that nobody else was invited to. "This is not clerical error," he said finally. No, I said. This is a plan. Wyatt looked at me with an expression that had shifted from the particular suspicion he had been aiming at me since the mountain road to something I did not have a clean category for. It was not warmth. It was closer to the way someone looks at a locked door after they have just been told it opens differently than they assumed. He did not thank me. He did not compliment me. He simply said, "What do you need?" which was somehow better. I needed access to 7 years of shipping ledgers, which they provided. I needed a faster courier system between the outlying villages, which Wyatt organized. I needed the council staff to stop reorganizing my floor map every time they entered the room, which Grant communicated in terms polite enough that nobody argued. Hudson brought dinner to the working room at the end of day 6 because I had missed it again. He set the tray on the least covered corner of the floor and sat down across from me with the specific ease of a person who has decided to be somewhere and is comfortable with that decision. "You've been in here for 14 hours, he said. "The invoices don't take breaks," I said. "Remarkable. Neither do you." He picked up one of the shipping ledgers, flipped through it upside down and set it back down. "This is all numbers. Most ledgers are. Don't you find it soulless?" "I find it honest," I said. "Numbers don't lie to you and then tell you you're being dramatic." There was a pause. Hudson's expression changed in the small specific way it changed when he filed something away for later. He did not ask about the dramatic comment. He reached across instead and straightened one corner of my floor map that had been bothering me for an hour without my saying so. "There's a private joke somewhere in this pile of papers," he said. "I'm going to find it. You're welcome to try," I said. 2 days later, he started drawing tiny wolves drowning in paperwork in the margins of official council memos. By the end of the week, every document that crossed my desk had at least one small wolf being dramatically destroyed by bureaucracy. I nearly choked during a supply meeting. Grant noticed. He said nothing about the drawings. He simply slid a blank page in front of me as though offering a canvas. I drew a wolf holding a tiny organized spreadsheet, perfectly calm, surrounded by chaos. Grant's mouth did something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. Wyatt caught me alone in the corridor after the meeting. He was about to say something. I could see him assembling the words, which was not a fast process for Wyatt because he did not say things he had not decided to mean. "The plan you presented," he started. "I would have rejected it yesterday." "I know," I said. "I would have been wrong." I looked at him. He met my eyes without flinching, which was not something powerful men usually did when admitting error to someone they had recently suspected of espionage. "Are you apologizing?" I asked. "I'm adjusting," he said. I found out 3 days later, from a palace clerk who thought I already knew, that Wyatt had gone back to every single checkpoint where he had initially dismissed my logistics suggestions and revised the procedures. Without telling me. That night, going through the last set of ledgers, I found it. Every sabotaged Blackridge shipment, traced fully, connected eventually to supplier chains operating out of Redwood territory. But not just any chain. The same parent company. The same controlling signature. Someone had been dismantling Blackridge while also dismantling Redwood, and both sets of hands pointed at the same source. Then I found the note that had been slipped under my bedroom door. 7 words in careful handwriting that made my blood go completely cold. Chapter 4. The note said, "If Parker Reed is alive, Blackridge is next." I read it 3 times. Then I folded it precisely and put it in my coat pocket and sat on the edge of my bed until my heartbeat decided to behave itself. Someone knew I was here. Someone who had either followed me from Redwood or had a contact inside this palace who had reported my presence. And that someone was not frightened of me being alive. They were frightened of who might protect me if I was. I brought the note to the Kings the next morning. Wyatt's reaction was immediate and entirely predictable. He wanted me moved into the fortified royal wing before I had finished explaining the situation. That location has 3 additional security layers, direct guard access from. "No," I said. "Parker." "That is a complete sentence," I said. "No." His jaw tightened. The air in the room shifted the way it shifts when a very large, very protective alpha realizes that the thing they want to do and the thing they are allowed to do are different things. I had been watching Wyatt manage that specific tension for 4 days now, and I understood it better than he thought. "You're in danger," he said, slowly, like I might have missed that detail. "I am aware. I found the note. I'm the one who handed it to you. Then you understand why moving you to the royal wing is protective on paper and suffocating in practice," I said. "I know what it looks like when protection becomes a different kind of cage, Wyatt. I spent 5 years in one. I am not doing it again." The room went very quiet. Grant was looking at the note. Wyatt was looking at me. Hudson was doing that thing where his entire posture appeared relaxed while every part of him was paying complete attention. Wyatt closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the Alpha Command posture had dropped into something different. Something more deliberate. "What would make you feel safe?" he asked. The question took me completely apart, and I refused to let it show. I told them what I needed. My own apartment, one that I chose. A guard station positioned far enough from the door that I was not being watched constantly. Entry by permission only, including from all 3 of them. I kept a copy of the key. No one entered without my knowing. They agreed without negotiating. Later, when I went to the apartment they had assigned me and walked through checking every door and window out of a habit I had not realized I had developed until that moment, I found that the guard station outside had been moved. Not slightly, significantly. It was now far enough down the corridor that I could not see it from my threshold. Nobody told me Wyatt had done it. I found out from a hallway attendant who mentioned it offhandedly 3 days later, as though it was a minor administrative detail. Grant came to my apartment that 4th night after Wyatt had moved the guard station, and I had spent the evening re-examining the supplier company records looking for a name. He knocked. He waited. He did not open the door until I opened it from the inside. He sat across from me in the small reading chair and said nothing for a long time, which was one of Grant's primary methods of communication and which I had, against my better judgment, begun to find comfortable. "After our father died," he said eventually, "I spent 4 months certain that Wyatt and Hudson would eventually stop pretending to share the crown and fight for sole control of it." I looked at him. "They are the 2 most stubborn people I have ever known," he continued. I rehearsed the argument I would make when it happened. I had points prepared. "What happened?" I asked. "They were too busy arguing about whether I was eating enough to bother with the crown." I absorbed this. "Powerful men are afraid of being abandoned too," he said. I had not said anything about fear of abandonment. I had not said anything about Ethan. Grant had arrived at it anyway through the particular route he always took, which was through the truth underneath what people were actually saying. We stayed up until sunrise, not talking about everything, not performing vulnerability at each other, just sitting in the same room at the same hour, which was its own form of honesty. The following morning, Hudson appeared outside the council chamber before a royal dinner with the diplomatic delegates and looked at my expression and immediately said, "How quickly do you think I could fake my own assassination?" I started laughing before I could stop myself. "We could be out in 4 minutes, he said. 3 if you walk fast. I've timed exits before." "Why have you timed exits before?" "Multiple reasons. All of them excellent." Then the message arrived from Noah. I nearly did not open it. My history with Noah Bennett extended to approximately 20 minutes of existing in the same room while my entire life rearranged itself without my consent. He was not high on my list of people I wished to hear from, but the message was short and what it said made my hands stop moving. Noah had not asked for Parker's removal. The political consort arrangement had not originated with the Bennett family. It had come through Victor Shaw, Redwood's high counselor. Victor had gone to the Bennett family first, then to Ethan, and he had constructed the entire alliance structure so that Ethan believed the pressure was coming from the council while the council believed the pressure was coming from the Bennett family. I had not been replaced because Ethan chose politics. I had been removed because Victor needed me gone. And then Grant's quiet voice from 2 nights ago came back to me. Powerful men are afraid of abandonment. Victor was afraid of something I had almost found. Chapter 5. The spring flood hit 6 weeks after I stopped trying to leave. The Northern River breached 2 containment points during a storm that dropped more water in 18 hours than the valley had seen in a decade, and by the time the palace received the first emergency message from the border villages, the lower roads were already under 3 feet of fast water. Wyatt was already pulling on his armor when I walked into the strategy room with the valley irrigation maps I had been quietly studying for the past month. "Stop," I said. He stopped. Purely out of surprise, I was fairly certain. I spread the maps across the table and pointed to the 2 dry elevation routes that curved above the floodline. They were not the direct roads. They were maintenance paths used by irrigation workers twice a year, narrow enough that standard military wagons could not use them, but wide enough for the smaller rescue vehicles that Blackridge kept in the Eastern Depot. Everyone in the room had been looking at the flooded roads. Nobody had been looking at the roads above them. Wyatt looked at the maps. He looked at me. "Take the Eastern Depot vehicles," I said. "Split between the 2 ridge paths. The first route reaches the Milford Village cluster in 40 minutes. The second cuts to the river settlements on the north side. You need to move the elderly and children before the second wave hits, which, based on the rainfall rate, is in approximately 2 hours." The room had gone still in the specific way rooms go still when someone has just said the correct thing in the correct order. Wyatt turned to his commanders. "Eastern Depot, both ridge paths. Move." He followed my evacuation routing for the entire operation. Afterward, when the villages had been cleared and the flood peaked where I had calculated it would peak, and the Eastern Depot vehicles came back with 312 people who would otherwise have been caught in the second surge, Wyatt stood at the edge of the ridge looking down at the valley and said nothing for a long time. Then he went into the emergency debrief and told the assembled council. "Parker designed the routing. Put his name on the report." I was not in the room when he said it. A supply clerk told me afterward, clearly expecting it to be unremarkable information. I stood in the corridor processing the concept of a powerful man putting my name on a report for work I had done. Ethan had submitted 12 years' worth of Redwood's winter survival records under the pack's collective administration without a single name attached except his own. 3 days later, I was alone with Wyatt in the medical tent they had set up on the ridge, cleaning a cut above his eyebrow from where a debris piece had caught him during the rescue. His face was 6 inches from mine. The lighting was low and the tent was quiet, and I could feel the specific warmth that Wyatt generated, which was substantial and distracting. Neither of us moved toward the other. He was waiting. I understood that clearly, not impatiently, just present. I finished cleaning the cut and stepped back, and his exhale was slow and even, and he did not say anything about the distance I put between us. He let me. 2 months after the flood, Hudson brought me to a trade negotiation between Blackridge and a rival Eastern Territory over disputed supply routes that I had spent 3 weeks untangling the logistics of. The rival pack's senior delegate, a broad alpha named Cass Remington who wore his superiority like a coat he had put on at birth and never reconsidered, looked at me across the negotiating table and said, pleasantly, that he had not realized Blackridge was sending a discarded Redwood Omega to handle its serious trade discussions. The room held its breath. Hudson's hand, which had been resting on the table, went still. I said, "The Northern Corridor bottleneck you've been charging Blackridge for is based on a transit volume assessment from 7 years ago. The actual current flow rate supports a renegotiated rate that is 31% lower. I have the updated measurements here." I placed the document in front of Remington. "If you'd like to continue discussing my resume," I said, "we can do that after you explain why your territory has been overcharging Blackridge by 1/3 for 3 consecutive years." Remington looked at the document. He looked at me. He signed the renegotiated terms that afternoon. Walking back through the palace corridor afterward, Hudson fell into step beside me and said quietly, "Remind me never to make you angry." "Too late," I said. "I know. I find it compelling rather than frightening, which may say something unflattering about me." That evening there was a formal celebration dinner for the treaty resolution. Hudson asked me to dance the way Hudson asked for things, which was with enough charm that the request felt like an inevitability and enough genuine question underneath it that I understood I could actually say no. I said yes. He placed his hand at my waist after asking whether that was acceptable. I told him yes. The moment became something I had not prepared for, which was serious. Not romantic in the performed way of public occasions. serious in the private way of two people who have been making each other laugh for 2 months and have just noticed what is underneath it. We did not acknowledge it. We danced, and Hudson's hand stayed exactly where I had allowed it. And when the music ended, we stepped back from each other with the careful precision of people managing something significant that neither of them is ready to name. 3 months after the treaty dinner, I fell asleep over the supply commission documents at my desk. I woke up with my head on Grant's shoulder, and the candles had burned down to stubs, and the clock on the wall said it was past 2 in the morning. Grant had been reading quietly beside me for hours, apparently, because he had not moved. I did not move immediately either. Then news arrived from Redwood. Ethan Blackwell was petitioning Blackridge for emergency assistance. The petition carried his personal seal. And Ethan was coming here with absolutely no idea that the Omega he had publicly replaced was now the person who controlled every supply route capable of saving him. Chapter 6. Ethan Blackwell's petition hit my desk 3 days before he arrived in person, and I read it twice with the specific calm of someone who has had 2 years to prepare for a moment and still finds it lands differently than expected. The petition was formally addressed to the Ashford Crown. It requested emergency grain allocation, medical supply restoration, and infrastructure consulting support for Redwood Pack's collapsing winter systems. It was written in the careful language of desperation dressed as diplomacy. Every sentence was constructed to sound like a request from a position of strength. Ethan had always been good at that. I set the petition down and went back to the supply commission schedule I had been working on before it arrived, because 300 families in Blackridge's northern settlements needed their winter delivery routes confirmed before I allowed myself to think about what it meant that my ex-mate was crossing the mountain border in 72 hours with his pack's survival in his hands. Grant found me at my desk at midnight. He did not ask whether I was all right. He set a cup of tea beside my elbow and sat down across from me and read through his own documents in complete silence, which was the Grant Ashford version of saying every important thing. I picked up the tea. We stayed like that until 2 in the morning. The morning Ethan arrived, I was already in the throne hall before the kings took their seats. I had reviewed the emergency supply projections for Redwood. I had cross-referenced their infrastructure collapse timeline against Blackridge's available resources. I had prepared the preliminary terms for an emergency assistance agreement that was fair, enforceable, and structured in a way that protected Blackridge's own winter reserves while providing Redwood with exactly enough support to survive the season. I had done this because thousands of people in Redwood were not responsible for what one man did on the night of the moon assembly, and logistics does not stop being necessary because the person requesting it broke your heart. I had also done this because I intended to be in that throne hall when Ethan walked in. He looked worse than I expected and worse than I wanted to admit I noticed. The journey had taken 3 days through difficult mountain roads, and it showed in the lines of his face and the careful steadiness of his posture, which was the posture of someone managing exhaustion through sheer force of authority. His pack's crisis was visible on him the way real weight always eventually becomes visible, settling into the jaw, the shoulders, the eyes. He stopped at the center of the hall. He saw the 3 kings above him and made his formal address with the practiced composure of an alpha who had been trained since childhood to never visibly crumble. He explained Redwood's situation. Grain reserves depleted by a coordinated supplier failure. Medicine shipments missing for 3 consecutive months. 2 border villages completely cut off from winter supply access. His own council's attempts to reroute had failed because the alternative supply networks they tried to access were either unavailable or under contract to companies that had stopped responding. He needed help. He asked for it with as much dignity as a man could hold while kneeling at another kingdom's door. Wyatt's face was stone. Hudson's was pleasant and unreadable. Grant was looking at the petition document I had prepared and set before them. Then Hudson picked it up and turned toward me, and in his most conversational tone, as though he were discussing the weather forecast, said, "Our mate already rejected those terms." Ethan's head turned. I came out from behind the eastern pillar, and the sound that Ethan did not quite make was something I will carry for a very long time. It was the sound of someone who had constructed a reality in which they were the center of the story, discovering that the story had continued without them. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Parker." I sat down in the chair Grant had already moved 3 inches closer to his own. Ethan looked between the three kings and then back at me with the expression of someone doing arithmetic that is producing impossible results. His eyes moved to Wyatt, who was sitting with the quiet, contained energy of a man who has decided not to move unless he needs to. Then to Hudson, who was watching Ethan with the particular pleasantness that meant Hudson was cataloging everything. Then to Grant, who set the preliminary agreement document directly in front of me rather than in front of Ethan. "Mate," Grant said. "Your approval." The hall went completely silent. Wyatt said, without looking away from Ethan, "Our mate has reviewed Redwood's supply projections." Hudson added, "Technically our terrifying almost mate, but the distinction is becoming administrative." I elbowed Hudson. He did not react. Ethan's face moved through 4 emotions in approximately 2 seconds. The 5th one settled into something I recognized from 5 years of knowing him, which was the expression he wore when he had calculated wrong and was processing the scale of the error. He thought I had arranged this. He thought this was revenge, performed, deliberate, designed to humiliate him in front of the most powerful court in the Northern Territories. I let him think it for 10 seconds. Then I said, "The preliminary terms are on the table. Blackridge can provide grain and medical supplies for 90 days with a renegotiation clause at 60. Infrastructure support will require a separate technical agreement." Ethan stared at me. "Parker, The terms," I said, "are fair. Read them." He looked like he had more to say. Before he could find it, the throne hall doors opened again and 2 guards came through moving fast, and between them, bloodied and exhausted and unmistakably alive, was Noah Bennett. Chapter 7. Noah looked like he had walked through a disaster to get here because he had. His traveling clothes were torn at the left shoulder. There was dried blood at his temple from a cut that had been pressed shut with a strip of cloth. He was moving under his own power but only barely, and when the guards released his arms he stood in the center of the throne hall and looked directly at me with the expression of someone who had rehearsed exactly 1 sentence for this moment and intended to say it before anything else happened. "Victor Shaw has records," Noah said. "I have copies." He reached inside his coat with a hand that was not entirely steady and produced a sealed leather document case. The room moved quickly after that. Grant took the case. Wyatt cleared the secondary council chamber and had Noah seated with water and a medic within 4 minutes, which was the Wyatt Ashford version of compassion, efficient and total. Hudson positioned himself between Ethan and the chamber entrance without making it look deliberate. I sat across from Noah while the medic cleaned the cut at his temple. Noah looked at me for a long moment. "I know what you thought of me," he said. "What you probably still think. You're my replacement with excellent hair," I said. "I've moved past it." The corner of his mouth moved. "I never wanted him. I need you to know that. My family was told the Bennett alliance would prevent a territorial conflict. Victor gave us documents projecting a military confrontation between Redwood and its eastern neighbors within 18 months unless the trade networks were consolidated through a political bond. My father believed it. I was presented as the solution and I was 23 and I did not know how to refuse a war I had been told only I could stop. I looked at him. "Victor manufactured the threat," Noah continued. "The military projections were false. I found the original analyst reports in his private office files 3 weeks ago when he sent me to retrieve a trade contract. The real numbers showed no significant conflict risk. He built a crisis out of paper and placed me inside it. I absorbed this. Noah had not stolen my life. He had been placed inside the hole that Victor dug and told to stand there and smile. "There is more," he said. He opened the document case. The records inside were dense and organized in the way that records kept by careful, patient, methodical criminals always are. Victor had been running a theft operation through the regional supplier network for 9 years. He controlled 6 trade companies operating across 4 territories. Those companies held supply contracts with both Redwood and Blackridge, the same parent company whose signature I had traced through Blackridge's sabotaged shipments. Victor had been taking from Blackridge's supply chain for 2 years. He had been weakening Redwood's reserves simultaneously. The goal was not simply money, though the money was substantial. The goal was to make both territories economically desperate enough that when he offered consolidated trade solutions through his companies, They would accept terms that handed him effective control of the entire northern supply network. He needed Parker Reed out of Redwood's administration because Parker Reed had been asking the wrong questions about supplier invoices for 6 months without realizing what the answers led to. Ethan, standing in the doorway of the secondary chamber where he had been allowed to remain, said nothing for a long time after Noah finished. Then he said, "I didn't know." Noah looked at him. "I know you didn't. That doesn't—" Ethan stopped. He tried again. "It doesn't change what I did." "No," Noah agreed quietly. "It doesn't." I had been watching Ethan's face through all of this. He was not performing guilt. Ethan had never been good at performing things he did not feel. What was sitting on his face was genuine and heavy and 2 years too late, and I had enough clarity now to see both things at once, that it was real and that it did not change anything. Grant came to find me that night, not in the council chamber, at my apartment. He knocked. He waited. I opened the door. He stood in the corridor looking at me with the specific expression that meant he had been thinking about something for several hours and had decided to say it directly. "You discovered Victor's operation before anyone recognized what it was," he said. "And then someone made sure you would be too hurt and too displaced to finish the work." "Yes," I said. "And you rebuilt yourself anyway," he said. "In a carriage on a mountain road with one bag and a bridge calculation." I looked at him. "Parker," he said, "I need to tell you something." He told me about the leaked documents, the forged messages carrying his royal seal that Noah's evidence had flagged. He had discovered them 4 months earlier. He had deliberately allowed falsified intelligence to continue moving through Victor's network because he believed it would help map the full scope of the operation. He had kept the plan from everyone, including me, because he had not wanted to risk Victor's contacts being alerted through any break in the pattern. The forged seal had been designed to look like Grant was feeding Victor information. Grant had been feeding Victor specifically chosen lies. It had worked, and he had made the decision to protect the outcome over protecting my right to know the risk I was standing inside. I stood there for a long moment. Then I said, "You should have told me." "Yes," he said. He did not add anything to that. No explanation dressed as justification. Just yes. "Ethan made decisions for me because he decided the outcome mattered more than my choice," I said. "You understand why that comparison is sitting in this room right now?" "I do," Grant said. "And I am not asking you to treat them as the same thing. I am telling you that you deserved the choice. I took it from you. I was wrong." The difference between those words and every explanation Ethan had ever offered me was the absence of the word "but." I was still processing that when the explosion hit. Chapter 8. The sound came from the north. Not a crack. A sustained, deep percussion that moved through the palace walls like the building had taken a breath and held it wrong. I was already moving before the second impact. The emergency maps for Blackridge's northern infrastructure were in my working room, which was 12 seconds from my apartment at a run, and I was running before anyone in the corridor had finished deciding whether to panic. Grant was behind me. Wyatt came through the eastern passage at the same moment I reached my door, already dressed for the field, because Wyatt Ashford's response to an unknown explosion was never to wait and see. "Northern Reservoir," I said, pulling the regional maps from the cabinet. "The containment wall on the upper reservoir has been failing by 11% load tolerance for 3 months. I flagged it in the February maintenance report." Wyatt was already looking at the map over my shoulder. "You think it's the wall?" "I think someone who has been reading Blackridge's maintenance reports knew it was the wall," I said. His expression shifted. I spread the full valley map across the table and the problem became visible immediately. The northern reservoir fed 3 systems. The primary grain storage basin sat directly in the lower flood path. The southern access road, the only viable emergency vehicle route, ran beside the irrigation channel that would overflow if the reservoir lost more than 40% containment. The eastern medicine warehouse was built on ground that would become unreachable within 90 minutes of a full breach. 3 simultaneous failures. Time to happen together. Victor had not sent his attack at the dam because he wanted to destroy a dam. He had sent it because a dam collapse here created 3 crises at once and solving one meant sacrificing another. Unless there was a fourth option. I found it in the mining survey records from 8 years before I arrived in Blackridge, which I had cataloged into the infrastructure archive during my 3rd month here because old maintenance records have a way of becoming useful at inconvenient moments. An abandoned diversion channel ran from the reservoir overflow point through an old mining cut in the eastern ridge and emptied into a lowland basin 2 miles north of the valley. It had been decommissioned when the mining operation closed. The diversion gate at the channel's entrance had not been operated in 6 years. If someone opened that gate manually before the containment wall failed completely, the overflow would be directed away from the grain basin, the road, and the warehouse. Hundreds of people would be safe. I told the Kings. Wyatt said, "I'll go." I said, "Absolutely not." He looked at me. "The gate mechanism requires someone who has read the maintenance spec." I said, "I read it 6 months ago. It is an 8-lever sequential system, and if you operate it out of order, it locks permanently." "I know the sequence." "Then tell me the sequence," Wyatt said. "There is no time to teach it," I said, which was true and also was not the entire truth, which was that the channel entrance required navigating a debris field from the original mine collapse, and the safe path through it was in my head and not on any current map. Hudson said, from behind us, "He's right, there isn't." Wyatt looked at Hudson. Hudson looked back at him with an expression that said clearly, "Let him do what he is built to do." Wyatt looked at me. "Come back," he said. It was not an order. It was something I did not have an easy word for, which was a very controlled, very honest request from a man who did not ask for things easily. I went. The channel entrance was a 20-minute drive and an 8-minute run through the debris field, and I made it in 26 minutes total because fear is an excellent motivator when several hundred people are in a flood path. The gate mechanism was exactly where the maintenance spec said it was, and the 8 levers were exactly as stiff as 6 years of disuse would make them, and my hands were shaking enough from the run that the 4th lever took 3 attempts. The diversion opened. The overflow redirected. The grain basin stayed dry. On my way back through the debris field, I heard the collapse. Not the reservoir wall. A secondary debris shift triggered by the ground pressure change, and the entrance path I had used folded behind me under 3 feet of rock and old timber. I was not afraid. I cataloged the alternate exit routes I had memorized from the mining survey, and I took the second one, which added 14 minutes and deposited me into a drainage ditch that I climbed out of covered in 6 years of accumulated mining sediment. Wyatt was standing at the ditch edge when I came up over the side. He had apparently run the entire perimeter of the debris field looking for the alternate exit. I hit his shoulder. He deserved it. He caught my arm when I lost my footing on the ditch edge, and then I was against his chest and his arms were around me and I was shaking, which I decided was an acceptable response to being buried in a mine debris field, and Wyatt's hand was at the back of my head and he was very carefully not saying anything. I held on longer than I meant to. Grant found us 10 minutes later. He looked at me with an expression that held an entire conversation's worth of relief, and then he cupped my face in both hands and waited, and I closed the distance myself. The first kiss was not elegant. I was covered in mining sediment and still slightly shaken, and Grant's hands were careful around my face like I was something worth being careful with, and then I gripped his coat and the careful part of it dissolved into something much more honest. When I pulled back, he looked at me like I had just rewritten something he had been reading wrong for 2 years. "That's inconvenient," I said. Grant laughed. Actually laughed. I filed that sound away immediately. Hudson appeared from behind the supply carriage 30 seconds later, assessed the situation in one look, and kissed my forehead. "One down," he said. "Excellent progress." I laughed until my chest hurt. Then Noah appeared at the field perimeter, pale and urgent, with new documents in his hands, and the laughter stopped. Victor's attack on the reservoir was not the primary target. It was a distraction. While Blackridge's military focused north, Victor's allies had already moved on Redwood. The council chamber had been seized. Victor intended to eliminate Ethan and blame the Ashford Kings, triggering a war between both territories while he controlled the supply lines that both sides would desperately need. Ethan was already in danger, and I was the only person in Blackridge who knew Redwood's interior supply routes well enough to get a counterforce through without Victor's people seeing it coming. Chapter 9. I agreed to go back to Redwood at 4 in the morning while the camp was still running on emergency lanterns and nobody had slept. The decision took approximately 45 seconds, which was long enough to run the logistics in my head and arrive at the same answer from 3 different directions. Victor's people had seized Redwood's council chamber and were holding position while waiting for confirmation that the Ashford Kings had been successfully implicated in the reservoir attack. The window before they consolidated control was narrow. Getting a counterforce through Redwood's border without being detected by Victor's network meant using the back supply routes, the ones that ran through the Eastern Ridge maintenance roads, the ones that only existed in my old route documentation because I had designed them as emergency access paths 2 years before I left. Nobody in Redwood's current administration knew those routes existed. Nobody in Blackridge knew them either. I was the only person on the mountain with that specific information inside their head, and thousands of people were sitting inside the consequence of what happened if I chose comfort over competence tonight. I went. Ethan found me at the supply staging area an hour before departure, while I was finalizing the route breakdown with Wyatt's field commanders. He stood 2 feet away from the table until I acknowledged him, which was more restraint than I expected. "I knew some part of you still cared," he said. I looked at him. "Ido." His posture shifted toward something that looked dangerously close to hope. "That is why I am saving your people," I said. "Do not confuse compassion with permission, Ethan." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What I did to you was wrong. Not the council pressure. Not Victor's manipulation. My choice. I chose to let you find out in a public assembly. I chose to ask you to be my secret. I chose to call you dramatic when you were actually just done." I looked at him directly. "Yes. I'm not asking to fix it," he said. "I know it's not fixable. I just needed you to know that I know." This was the most honest thing Ethan Blackwell had ever said to me. I gave it the weight it deserved, which was real, and then I went back to the route breakdown because there were 7 field commanders waiting and a coup to stop. The operation moved in 3 coordinated pieces. Wyatt controlled the military positioning, bringing Blackridge forces through the Eastern Ridge maintenance roads in complete silence while Victor's network watched the main border crossings. Hudson activated every diplomatic contact he had built across the region simultaneously, publicly calling an emergency session of the Interterritorial Trade Council and forcing Victor's political allies to respond to official proceedings rather than coordinating with their field operatives. Grant released Victor's financial records through 4 separate legal channels at the same moment, so that any attempt to suppress one would only amplify the others. My piece was the supply routes. Victor's forces believed they controlled Redwood's access points because they controlled the documented roads. They did not know about the maintenance paths. They did not know that the Eastern Ridge had 6 access points built into its infrastructure for emergency supply restoration, or that those access points connected to Redwood's internal distribution network at precisely the points where Victor's forces were thinnest. I fed Victor false evacuation schedules through Noah, who delivered them with the convincing exhaustion of someone who had genuinely been through enough disaster to look authentically wrecked. Victor redirected his warehouse seizure teams to 3 locations that had already been quietly emptied 12 hours earlier. His people arrived to secure strategic reserves that no longer existed. Wyatt's forces came through the Eastern Ridge while Victor's network was pointing the wrong direction. The council chamber was retaken in 40 minutes. Victor was found at the Eastern Mountain Tunnel, which was supposedly a secret exit route known only to senior Redwood Council members. He had been heading for it for 20 minutes when he arrived at the outlet and found me standing at the exit with 2 Blackridge field officers and an expression that I was told later was extremely unsettling. I had designed the maintenance map that included this tunnel's exit coordinates during my 2nd year in Redwood. Victor had used a version of that map to plan his escape. He had not known that I was the one who made it. "You removed me," I said, "because you were afraid of how much I understood." Victor looked at me. "You were right to be afraid," I said. He was arrested and transported to Blackridge custody within the hour. Ethan was alive. Redwood was intact. The coup collapsed before it finished assembling itself, because the man who planned it had spent 2 years believing that removing Parker Reed meant removing the problem. He had never considered that the problem, from his perspective, had spent those 2 years becoming significantly larger. That night, in the temporary command post set up in Redwood's eastern warehouse, I went to the 3 Kings myself. Not because the crisis was over, Not because the adrenaline had nowhere else to go. Because I had spent 2 years letting fear sit in the driver's seat of every decision that involved staying, and I was finished with it. I told them I was choosing them, not because they were kings, not because of any biological pull that Omegaverse instinct produced, because Wyatt had learned that protecting me sometimes meant standing still, because Hudson had learned the difference between when I was being funny and when I was trying not to fall apart, because Grant had made a mistake and owned it without a single justifying word, because all three of them had consistently treated my freedom as something worth protecting rather than something worth outlasting. Hudson kissed me first, and I had approximately 1 second of warning before it became thorough enough that I forgot what words were for. When I remembered, I said, "There is still paperwork." Hudson said, "Terrible timing, honestly." Wyatt cupped my face in both hands when his turn came and waited. And when I closed the distance, the kiss was slow and deliberate and exactly as serious as Wyatt Ashford was about everything he decided to mean. Grant pulled me in by the back of my neck, and the gentleness of it undid me completely. Outside, Ethan filed his formal emergency assistance acceptance and went back to managing what remained of his pack. Inside, surrounded by 3 men who had never once asked me to be smaller, I chose to stay. Then morning arrived, and with it, Ethan's legal challenge. Redwood law, he had discovered, contained a provision allowing a prior mate claimant to contest an external bond formed during an unresolved mate contract period. His argument was that Parker Reed's bond with the Ashford Kings could be declared legally invalid because the original mate contract between Ethan Blackwell and Parker Reed had never been formally dissolved. If Ethan invoked that provision, my bond with all 3 brothers could be declared treason against Redwood's mating code. Chapter 10. The hearing was called for the following morning in Redwood's main council chamber, the same room where 2 years ago I had walked in expecting a celebration and found the architecture of my life being quietly disassembled while everyone watched. Ethan had requested the proceeding through proper legal channels, which was the correct way to do it and which I respected in the same way you respect a fire for being hot. It exists. It will burn you. Respect it. I spent the night before the hearing reading Redwood's mating law documentation. Not because I was panicking, because I had read it once before, 3 weeks after arriving in Blackridge, on a quiet evening when I was processing everything that had happened and needed to understand the legal terrain of what had been done to me. I had read it carefully and thoroughly the way I read everything, and somewhere around the 47th page I had found something that Ethan's counsel, and apparently Ethan himself, had never noticed. I walked into the hearing the next morning with one document. The chamber was full. Redwood's surviving council members, Blackridge's legal representatives, Noah, sitting in the civilian observer section with an expression of focused attention, Wyatt, Hudson, and Grant positioned behind the respondents' table with the stillness of men who trusted a plan they had not been given every detail of, which was a form of confidence in me that I felt in my chest like something warm and structural. Ethan presented his argument. His legal advisor was thorough. The provision existed. The mate contract had not been formally dissolved prior to Parker Reed forming bonds with the Ashford brothers. Under Redwood mating code, external bonds formed during an unresolved contract period could be contested and declared invalid. The chamber waited. I set the document on the table and slid it toward the council's presiding officer. "This is the political alliance agreement Ethan Blackwell signed with the Bennett family," I said. "Specifically, page 11, subsection 4, clause 7. The presiding officer opened it. I said, "Clause 7 states that in executing the political consort arrangement, the Alpha Party confirms the voluntary dissolution of all prior conflicting mate contracts, effective on the date of the consort announcement, in order to ensure the legal clarity of the new alliance bond." The chamber was silent. "Ethan signed that document," I said. "He signed it on the night of the Moon Assembly. Clause 7 dissolved our mate contract the moment he announced Noah as his official consort." I looked at Ethan. "You released me 2 years ago," I said. "You simply never read the section that affected me, because you assumed I would stay regardless of what the document said." Ethan looked at the paper, at his own signature at the bottom of page 11. The silence in that room was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Ethan did not argue. He sat with his own signature looking back at him, and he accepted it the way a person accepts a consequence that they generated themselves. His legal advisor whispered something. Ethan shook his head. After the hearing, Ethan voluntarily announced his intention to step down as Redwood's alpha and request a civilian transition council, citing his failure to protect his pack's administrative integrity and his own role in allowing Victor's network to operate unchallenged. He did not frame it as noble sacrifice. He framed it as correction. He would live. He would rebuild. He would do it without access to me. Noah refused the consort title he had technically held for 2 years. He accepted a seat on Redwood's new civilian council instead, which suited him considerably better. On his way out of the chamber, he stopped beside me and said, "You were impossible to replace." I said, "You were a terrible replacement." He laughed, and it was real, and somewhere in the middle of it we became something that had no category yet but was clearly the beginning of a friendship built on the particular bond of two people who survived the same disaster from opposite sides. In the afternoon session, the Ashford brothers formally offered me the title of Royal Consort Mate. I declined. Grant's expression did not change. Hudson raised an eyebrow. Wyatt waited. I said I wanted a different title. One with equal legal authority, equal decision-making standing, and a name that did not carry the historical weight of ownership that the word consort had accumulated across 300 years of mating law. I said I wanted to be called the Fourth Crown. The chamber erupted. It took 40 minutes and Grant's complete familiarity with Blackridge's foundational legal texts to establish that there was no existing provision prohibiting the designation, which was not the same thing as permission but was legally close enough to proceed on. The Kings agreed. That evening, in the private sitting room of Blackridge's temporary Redwood delegation quarters, all three brothers knelt in front of me. Not because I required submission, because the last time Parker Reed was publicly chosen, another man decided everything without asking. Wyatt said, "Will you stay?" Hudson said, "Preferably permanently. I have strong feelings about permanence." Grant said, "Only if staying remains your choice every morning." I looked at the three of them. I thought about a mountain road and a carriage door and a question about bravery and stupidity. I thought about floor maps and mining surveys and a first kiss in a drainage ditch. I thought about what it felt like to be somewhere that did not require me to be smaller to fit inside it. "Yes," I said. The following week, I used my new legal authority to submit formal mating law reform proposals to both Blackridge and Redwood's governing councils. Political mating could not supersede an existing relationship without explicit dissolution and documented consent. Mate bonds could not legally restrict movement or employment. Scent, biology, and designation status could not be used as grounds to deny legal personhood. The proposals passed. The silver mate clasp that Ethan had returned to me during the hearing sat on my desk for 3 days before I knew what to do with it. Then I had it melted down and made into 4 rings. One for me, one for Wyatt, one for Hudson, one for Grant. Nobody owned anybody. For equal choices, made every morning by people who had decided that freedom and love were not opposites. That night I was lying between Hudson and Wyatt with Grant reading in the chair beside the bed and Hudson was making a formal complaint about the blanket distribution situation. "This is statistically impossible," he said. 3 alphas and 1 omega, and the omega controls 100% of the blankets. "Competence," I said. Wyatt pulled me closer. Grant reached over and tucked the blanket edge properly without commenting. Hudson stole an entire corner and declared victory. 2 years ago, I walked out of a room because someone decided I was replaceable. Now 3 Kings knew what Ethan had learned too late. I was never difficult to love. I was simply impossible to own. A week later, a sealed letter arrived on my desk bearing a family crest I had not seen in 18 years. My parents had supposedly died when I was 6. The crest was mine by blood, which meant it should not exist. The letter contained 6 words. "Your mother would like you home. The end."